as managers what you'd actually do to manage the pines here and where you'd start. I mean, I understand that there's a problem, but thinking about where you'd actually start and how you'd actually do it. You can't just knock down all the pine trees in areas over there, otherwise you'd be left with the grassland, and then you've got the funding for re-establishment. Some of these areas here, if you can't just bring logging machinery in because you'd be knocking down the eucalypts you want to save. So thinking about what you do, where you'd start, and maintain the values this area still has. So the recreation values you still have in the dam. So lots of people swim and kayak there in summer, I'm told.
Yes,
Brave souls.
Yeah.
People on this is the Skipton Ballarat Rail Trail, I'm informed. By, so people, obviously no one right now, but people often use that as a bit of cycle touring. They catch the train up to Ballarat, come along here, and they'll either camp or stay in Skipton and ride back the next day. So there's other values that can be affected by the management. So your job as fire managers is doing that trade-off of making sure you're not damaging the environment while you do the fire management, but making sure you don't have the risk to people and property like the community here when the fire seasons are bad. So those trade-offs are quite challenging, and yeah, as Helena said, it's 2014 you started talking to people about this, so we're 8 years down the track. Unfortunately in land management that's not a long time. I'm sure it's very frustrating for Helena, but thinking about where do you start? If you take out 10 trees, is it a big difference? Probably not. But you could start to think about where you go. So you could potentially come through and take out the seedlings here for the pines, but you're still going to have the big trees. But you could actually use that as a bit of a start and stage these processes. But our DELP funding cycles and other government funding cycles are relatively short term compared to what we need to do. So this is a long-term project to do this. It's probably a 20-year project to revert this back to native woodland, native forest. But you've got to start. If you don't start, you don't finish. So you've got to start somewhere. And as you've heard from Helena, there's Water Board, there's DELP, there's Council, there's the other council and the other council, and there's CFA, all thinking from different sides about how they do it. And HVP, which is Hancock's changed HVP a few years ago, I think. So depending on when you got to know them, they use different names. They don't have any rights to come into DELP land to do work. So if they wanted to, they don't have the ability to come in because they're not allowed to operate forestry. They're not allowed to operate on DELP land because it's not their land. And then you also have the public perception. If someone rides through here and they say logging equipment on DELP land that's not scheduled for logging, what's the public outcry over that as well? So there's lots of different dimensions to these problems, and there's lots of challenges for all the players involved, but they've got to actually start somewhere and start doing things. So start small and build up.
How does fire affect like pines next generation? Like, are they similar to eucalypts that they can bounce back real nice?
No, they'll kill it generally. So a high severity fire will kill all the pines through here.
And you wouldn't see them come back into the environment?
You would, if they got reseeded from elsewhere, but they generally wouldn't come back if you had a high enough severity that burnt the cones and things. So your next question being...
And then the other one is, what are the effects on like fauna for the pines? Like, do you think there's a general decrease in...
Yeah, so pine plantations don't have a lot in them. They do well for wombats, kangaroos, occasional snake, but for anything else they're not great. Except for cockatoos, they love them. And that's why you get such spread, because the cockatoos will pick up the cones and move them. So yeah, you're simplifying the structure, you're simplifying the floristic diversity for the different nectar feeders and things like that. You're removing some of the seed source for a whole range of other things. So it becomes it moves towards a monoculture like we saw over there. There were largely trees and a couple of small grasses underneath, so the diversity values aren't there, which is probably fine for the agricultural style applications up that we saw as we came into town, and because that's what they're producing. Down here though, where it's a community, it's DELP land that the community use for recreation and they'd like to use for conservation and fire management, it's not really what you want there. It's too challenging. And as we said up the top, the fire behaviour in pines on a bad day is just floor to ceiling fuel, so it's going to burn quite hot. I mean, you could trial burning through here, but you'd have to do it on a very dry day, in which case you'd probably get your fire out of control and not be with inside. So one of the things, and Helena mentioned this before about prescribed burning being seen as the answer to everything, we're getting shortened windows when we can actually burn, and we'll talk about that in a second. But also it doesn't do everything, and we don't have the crews available, and the crews aren't experienced in burning in areas like this. Perhaps in the past there were people that were used to a wider range because they were on the land all the time, but now we've got a limited set of experience there because that's what's happened. We've gone for certain areas more than others, and that's how it's changed over time. So we're working, there's a project we're doing now down in the southwest, looking at the scope or the reasons for burns, and then how you could actually develop prescriptions for different type of burns. So if you're burning gorse, for example, it's a shrub, it's a wind-driven fire, so it can be wetter on the ground and you can burn the gorse and get rid of it. But that's actually outside prescription at the moment. When you burn the gorse within prescription, you're actually at really high risk of things escaping or not burning the gorse. So trying to look at getting the prescriptions to match the outcomes, and this would be a really good example of that, where you're saying you're trying to burn to get the pines out. So a day with a little bit of wind, maybe the surface is too wet to burn, but you try and get it to, that's almost a shrubland through there, try and get it to carry. But it's complex, and it takes, institutions don't change overnight, as I'm sure you're probably all aware. It takes time to turn the cargo ship around, or a major fire season.
I think there was